Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. This event is brought to you by ASQ, the American Society of Quality, and ASQ Government Division. The Government Division is a community of practitioners focused on quality and performance improvement for federal, state, local, and international governments. Our upcoming webinars on July 19, we have our Government Division General Membership Meeting. You can go to the ASQ Government Division website to learn more about our next event and to register. Today's session will be interactive. You can also use the Q&A tab or the chat box to send any questions you have during the presentation. We will address them at the end. And if there's a question that I don't get through, we will send you the answer via email within the next 3 days. The contact information for our division officers and the speakers will be available at the end of the presentation. So today we have the pleasure to introduce our presenters, Tom Mosgaller, Michael Williamson, and Tim Hallock. Bending Granite, they will be talking to us about their book, Bending Granite. Bending Granite is a book about change. It tells the stories of 30 plus leaders from 30 organizations over 30 years who have successfully led change in their organizations. The book is organized around three themes: purpose, process, and people. The stories in this book are full of practical insight that can be applied to any organization looking to make positive change. It is a must read for anyone who wants to be a more effective leader. Our presenters today are all experts in the field of change. They have all led successful change efforts in their own organization. They are going to read some of the stories from Bending Granite and then get your impressions, experience, and comments as part of the dialogue to think about changes. To have the interactive part, I will request to unmute all the participants so you can be allowed to talk when the time comes. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our presenters. Tom Mosgaller is a lifelong community organizer. Tom guides people to take charge and address the inequities around them. He is a change agent by nature and a leader by nurture. He served as the City of Madison's Director of Quality and Productivity and as the President of the American Society of Quality, ASQ. Michael Williamson has led complex public sector organizations for 41 years, including founding groundbreaking improvement initiatives for the City of Madison, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the state of North Carolina. Michael serves on the numerous boards where he helps bring order out of chaos. Tim Hallock is a certified Lean Six Sigma Master Black Belt dedicated to unleashing the improvement talents of frontline employees. He is a Baldrige National Quality Award applicant and examiner who supports the Wisconsin Forward Award as an applicant, examiner, instructor, and judge. He is currently sharing lessons of change on his podcast, Bending Granite. Welcome to all three of you.
So we're going to start with you, Tom. And before Tom starts, I just want to mention that the readings are actually recordings from our podcast, Bending Granite. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. And I apologize for the first reading. It's a little bit muddy at the front end. So listen closely because it's a really good story. But it gets better as it goes along. And then so listen close. I think you'll hear it just great. Tom, I'll turn it over to you. You want to say anything, Tom?
No, I think we should just get people into the story. And this story was a story that emerged from work I did at the University of Wisconsin Engineering School on improving addiction treatment and mental health facilities around the country. And one of the things we did every month was to do a walkthrough of a different facility someplace in the country in order to keep ourselves grounded in the work that we were trying to do. So this story is about one of those walkthroughs.
Did you say he threatened to kill himself? Yes, he just told me he had had enough and wanted me to open the gun safe so he could get his rifle. I told him I wouldn't do it, but he is very agitated and says he will find a way into the safe. I was really worried about my family. That was the beginning of the call I made to the intake specialist at our local mental health facility. Our 23-year-old nephew, Brian, was living in a bedroom above our garage after his parents had thrown him out. He was an avid hunter, but I had secured his gun as a requirement for his moving into our house. Brian has had numerous run-ins with the law and suffered from a number of mental health issues, including depression and attention deficit disorder. He had spent part of the winter at a men's shelter and would do most anything to avoid going back there. The good news was he trusted me, and he knew if he cooperated, he would have a roof over his head, food in his belly, and an uncle who would have his back. After the intake specialist ran through the suicide protocol, she recommended I bring him in immediately. We both were concerned he might harm my wife and family. As the car approached the building, we noticed that the front entrance was under renovation and jackhammers were busting up the concrete walkway. A crew was pouring cement for new steps. We began to navigate our way when a mason pointed at a yellow plastic crime scene tape going around the side of the building. No one had given us a heads up that they were under construction. I worried that the crime scene tape might trigger an anxiety attack for Brian. I considered for a moment leaving rather than asking for directions. Once Brian and I got inside the reception area, we tried to figure out how to let someone know that we were there. Brian pointed to a glass window across the room with a round hole in it. The lighting behind the window was dark, so it was hard to see if anybody was even there. We walked cautiously across the dimly lit reception area, which was full of other clients, some sitting, some pacing, and a few at a table in the corner bent over taking a nap. The only directions were an old sign with black lettering on a blue piece of paper right below the window that said, "If you have been here more than 30 minutes, inform the receptionist." I worried that we were going to be there for a long while. I put my face up to the glass hole, stated my name, and introduced my nephew, Brian. I explained that the intake specialist had told us to come in immediately to see a counselor. The receptionist said she had not received any notification that we were coming and told us to go take a seat. I tried to plead my case and ask her to talk to the intake specialist to get verification of the urgency in Brian's threats. She looked at me, and you could tell from her gaze that she had seen it all, heard every story, and had no patience with plea. She did say they were going to get us in as soon as possible. So I said, "What does as soon as possible mean?" She was getting irritated, and I could feel the hair on my neck going up and could sense all the eyes in the reception area were focused on us. To her credit, she said she would try to find out if we were going to be getting in immediately and pointed to a couch across the room. After 35 minutes, I went back up to the window, peeked in, and asked how much longer it was going to be. I tried to whisper to her that Brian was getting agitated. She said, "Do you see all those other people? They have stories too. We're down to 2 staff, and we're working as fast as we can. Now go sit down." And she went back to her computer screen. As Brian's agitation increased, I knew there would be a point where he would just get up and bolt for the door. When I sat down, I told him it would be only a few more minutes. I really had no idea how long it was going to be. 50 minutes after we had first gone up to the window, the lady behind the glass with the hole in it said she had talked to the intake specialist and moved our mental health assessment with a counselor up, and it looked like she would probably be seeing me in the next half hour. I looked at my nephew. I could tell it was too late. He shook his head to let me know he couldn't stay there any longer. I understood, and we walked back out through the construction noise and got in the car. Fortunately, Brian's emotional breakdown was only a fictional scenario. My colleague and I had created it as a way for us to deeply understand what clients experienced at one of our city's oldest mental health providers. The method is called the walkthrough, and it was the first thing we required any team looking at improving their services to do, to appreciate what it's like to be in the shoes of your client. The walkthrough process was one tool we used in the simple problem-solving process developed at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Engineering Department. It was called NIATER, Network for the Improvement of Addiction Treatment Services, and it was a way of improving addiction treatment and mental health services across the country. The director of the Madison facility had heard about NIATEX and called us. He knew he had problems, but wanted a set of fresh eyes to look at our intake process. The call to the intake specialist set the walkthrough script in motion. After completing our walkthrough, we had the most important step to do. The next day, we met with the executive director of the facility while our experience was fresh. We described our experience step by step from the phone conversation with the intake specialist to our arrival at the facility to the encounter of looking through the round hole in the glass with the receptionist to our final exit without getting service during an emergency. Director just sat there in shock. To his credit, he didn't try to make excuses for what we experienced or defended the system. We told him we did walkthroughs of different facilities every month as a way of keeping us grounded in what it feels like to be in the shoes of a client. We reminded him we were not there to judge or blame, but to help him improve the care of his clients. Before we left, the director stood up and asked, "So where do we start?" I said, "We start by working with a team from the facility, flowcharting the entire process as it really is. That would include the intake specialist, the lady behind the glass with the hole in it, their supervisor, and a counselor. And you would serve as the leader of the team."
Okay. That's our story.
So Tim, you want me to take it?
Yes, it's on. Oh, sorry. Hang on, I'll turn off the extra sounds I got going. All right, there you go. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, so we just wanted to take a few minutes after you listen to this to share any kind of observations or particular images in the story that stood out to you from your experience, or something that triggered your imagination. So anybody, just hop in and let's have a few minutes of conversation about this situation. This is where you get to talk, folks. Anyone out there?
We do. I'm not sure they're about the. I don't see anybody trying to unmute. I'm not sure they are able to unmute. Can someone please let us know if they're able to unmute themselves in the chat? So Shruti said, what stood out was the way you influenced the leader. Oh, Steve and Kevin are unable to unmute.
Is there something you can do as the host? If you go over to their over to the participants to unmute?
Yes.
You might,
that's what I'm trying to do. I don't know why it's not muting unmuting everybody.
So Tom, you want to say something about the effect that it had on, somebody asked that question, the effect it had on the leader. What was the impression you got from the leader when you came back and told your story?
Well, I think the first thing is that this was a leader who was willing to have someone come in and take a look at their place. That they knew there was something that they weren't optimizing their system of delivery. They'd been getting feedback to that effect. And that they were willing to be part of an effort to try and improve the service delivery. So, I give them credit for that willingness to be exposed to a walkthrough. And then at the end of it, when we actually went in and sat down and shared this with them, I mean, I can still see the reaction of the shoulders slumping and kind of the behavior when someone is being told that this place may not be as good as its public image and that we have an opportunity here to do some real improvement. And, they followed through. They heard what we had to share as honest feedback. And then they also were willing to put the team together and to learn how to lead that team. So that team became the beginning of looking at that intake process. But then from there on, they went into an array of other processes that had to be improved, like the way in which that waiting area looked and how it felt culturally. And we spent a lot of time with him talking about the kind of cultural responsibility, or as Deming would have taught us, management works on the system, people work in it. It's your job to create a culture in which your people can take pride in what they do at that front window when they move up to taking on a consulting role, whatever it is. So it was a real transformative experience for that leader who became a real champion for our work, and their facility became highly regarded in the region.
Okay.
So, Tom, there's a couple of things in the chat. What happens if they refuse to see the issue or are unwilling to be open to improvements? And the other ones is, was there a conversation with the leader's team? How was their reaction? There are usually at least some people who resist change and inspections, even if it's for the best.
Yeah, those are great questions. And I would just say that in terms of the first question of the leader's ability to actually take on the willingness to change, I think that is just fundamental. And if they're not, my sense is you don't try pushing through that. I think it's the old Kenny Rogers thing. You know when to hold them, when to fold them, when to walk away, when to run. We would just maintain the relationship, and maybe at another point, they know where to get a hold of us. And we invited them to other events where they could hear other people who are doing this work, with the hope that other leaders might influence him and his ability to consider being vulnerable. And secondly, yes, there were a number of team members who were skeptical and defensive, but we were able to work through that when we really, my partner, who was the person playing the person with the addiction problem, and I went back and sat in the room with them and just walked through with them and explained to them, we're doing this not to cause blame or point fingers, but to improve everything that we do in the interest of the client, and the fact that everybody hopefully cares about the client's experience. And we were able to work through that. And that resistance, I think it's a great question because it happens every darn time, but usually we can get through that. Thank you for asking those questions.
Yeah, I think there's another quick question that's really interesting. It was the question about the impact of using this process versus just a paper process where people kind of sit in a room and talk about their process. So can you just touch on that a little bit about the
that is such a good point somebody's raising. I mean, my sense is if you do not experience it personally, walking through that is totally different than when you look at a flip chart or a bunch of Post-its on a wall. The ability to objectify that, and I've gone through hundreds of improvement projects, and we just require right off the bat that you got to do the walkthrough. If you're not willing to step in the shoes and do the walkthrough and physically feel the emotional impact, and you want to keep it at arm's length, you are not going to oftentimes really get to root cause. You will not experience what a client feels when that event happens in their lives. So we became really adamant as part of our work that you had to do the walkthrough.
Yeah, that whole thing
is relational.
Yeah.
It's relational. It takes it from objective to emotionally connected.
Yeah, there's a big difference between seeing the process on a flip chart or on, Post-it notes and experiencing those Post-it notes. So,
Amen.
yeah. All right. Well, that was pretty good. I think since Anna, you're not able to unmute everybody,
No.
we'll just take some time after the next story to just everybody start writing your chat, and we'll look at that. That seemed to work out pretty good. Michael and I looked at it this time. Michael's going to do his story now, and he'll respond to some of your questions, and we can respond to them too. But then Tom and I will read some of the questions in the chat and keep up with that. All right. So let me move on to the next story. You want to bring that slide up, Anna? And Michael, do you want to say anything as I pull it up?
Sure. My name is Michael Williamson. The story that I'm about to tell you had to do with the first process improvement team that was created in the city of Madison in the early 80s. And at that time, we had become aware of Deming's work and the work that was going on in process improvement, but all we had to go from was Japanese industrial models. And we were the first governmental unit in the country to practice this. And this is a story about the first process improvement team. So Tim, why don't you let it roll? And then if you have questions as we go through, be sure to put them in the chat and we'll talk about them afterwards. Things were bad. They were really bad at the city of Madison in 1983. Good working equipment was hard to come by. If you were the chief of police and you couldn't get officers on the street because your squad cars were sitting at the city garage, it was a problem. If you were the public works director and it was peak park season and you couldn't get the parks mowed in a timely manner because your gang mowers were broken down, it was a problem. The same thing with public works, the same things with the streets department, with the forestry crews, the list went on. So what was the problem? Well, vehicles and equipment were sitting at the staging lot in the city's First Street garage for days before a mechanic could even look at them, let alone determine what the problem was, get them fixed and back on the road again. The light was quickly thrown on the mechanics. I mean, after all, they were union mechanics. So they had to be at least part of the problem, if not all of it. So solutions started flying. Fire some of the lazy mechanics and the rest of them will work harder. Contract out their work to the private sector because the private sector is much more efficient than the public sector. Give them more positions so they can handle the backlog. Lesson number one, for every complex problem, there's a simple answer, and it's almost always wrong. You know how this works. Something comes up in the organization, people start throwing out ideas, not based upon any data, it's just impulse. I call it grasping at straws. But this time it was different. The mayor, Joe Sensenbrenner, had just been down to the UW-Madison for a 2-day seminar by a guy by the name W. Edwards Deming. And there he had heard these examples about how the Japanese were transforming their manufacturing process. And so he came back and he thought there must be a different and better way to look at this situation using these new techniques he just heard about. The problem was there was no examples in the public sector. All we had was translations of Japanese industrial models. Lesson number 2, never waste a crisis. So we decided to apply these new techniques because this was a crisis. And you never waste a crisis if you want to drive change in an organization. It's your best way to alter the status quo. Enter faculty from the UW-Madison, and specifically a guy by the name of Bill Hunter. He was a white shirt, black tie wearing guy, educated at Princeton, and now he was on the esteemed faculty of the statistics faculty at UW. Lesson number 3, the 85-15 rule is alive and well. Now, Professor Hunter agreed to work with us on our initial process improvement team, and he understood the 85-15 rule. You know, those of you are familiar with it, but 15% of the improvement opportunities rest in the hand of the workers, 85% rest with management. So Professor Hunter asked to meet the workers, the mechanics, where they were, trapped in a process with which they had little control. So we took him there, and he made his pitch that they would work together to study and improve the process by using the new technique. Terry Holmes was the president of the union, and he responded to Bill. He said, "You are not telling us anything new. We understand what you're saying. The system is broken, and they are blaming us. Do you think you and this new idea can help us?" Lesson number 4. In God we trust, all others must bring data, and the data will set you free. So we created our first process improvement team, and we empowered the employees and the members to go out and to collect data on the process. And what we got back was pretty surprising. First of all, equipment was being kept online much longer than it had been in the past. A decade ago, equipment was replaced every 10 years. Now it was being replaced every 21 years. Our equipment was all purchased on low bid. We were a public agency, so we used low bid. Well, what that meant is we bought the cheapest product every time. There was no consistency in terms of manufacturers, in terms of models. We just got the cheapest product each time. And it was impossible to keep parts for all these different types of equipment. Each had to be ordered itself every time something broke. But most surprising was the time it took to get the purchasing requests approved. And we found out that it took 28 steps to purchase a part, and the longest period of time was resting in City Hall with the city comptroller's office waiting for them to approve the purchase of the part. Lesson number 5, tirelessly watch for unnecessary approval steps that slow down processes. Something breaks and new steps are added. We all know how this works. The process gets longer, it gets more cumbersome, and it never gets looked at in its entirety. Extra steps and complexity grinds down the process. But with study and data now, recommendations for improvement at the city garage were getting clearer. Team recommended adopting a more effective replacement schedule. City mechanics should work with their customers to determine what were the primary and priority pieces of equipment that needed to get back on the street and work on those first. And finally, purchasing decisions were delegated to the managers at the garage. So how did things turn out, you might ask? Well, repair time dropped from an average of 9.5 days to 48 hours. The purchasing steps went from 28 down to 7. And rather than increasing costs by hiring more mechanics, annual savings from the new improvements generated an estimated $750,000 in savings. The outcome, the First Street Garage and their team became famous. They made it into Deming's next book. Professor Hunter and Terry Holmes traveled the country to share their story. They even presented at Ford Motor Company. Now, fancy that. The private sector learning something from the public sector. And most important, quality management had been birthed in the city of Madison. We became the first governmental body to apply its principles in the country and, to best of our knowledge, anywhere else in the world. What a shame it would have been to waste a crisis. So, folks, that's the story. Now, there is an epilogue to this story because the bond between Bill Hunter and the mechanics at the garage was more than professional. It became personal. So when Bill Hunter died from cancer at the much too early age of 49, the two head mechanics requested to pay their final respects in a special way to a man who believed in them. Their request was honored, and before he was buried, Terry Holmes and Joe Turner dug by hand the grave that was to hold Professor Bill Hunter's body. So that is the end of the story. And I'm open to questions or comments, things that jumped out at you that you can relate to from your organizational experience. There are some lessons in there that I thought were particularly relevant, but it was a powerful exercise. And it, as I said, it was the first in the city of Madison's history.
I got questions. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Good. This is Bob Fanning. I know you guys from other meetings. How long did it take from kind of when you started working on the project to when you realized that $750,000 return?
Well, it took about 9 months for the project team to do its work and to get the data, but it was longer than that before we actually had the numbers on the savings. So that probably took over a year before we were able to actually quantify that. But because it was new and we were learning and we were using Bill Hunter and nobody in the city had ever done a process improvement team, we didn't have any trained facilitators. It took us over 9 months to just get the product generated. But it took longer than that to be able to actually quantify the savings.
Yeah, I would think, did you change the purchasing process? Did they start buying all of one style lawnmower or police vehicle?
Well, that was a slower process. A great question, but that was a slower process. It took longer to eventually get to where we got the user's input into the purchases. It wasn't just on the lowest cost. It was what would work best for the system. And that eventually manifested itself into buying police cars. We had the officers who rode in the police cars to actually be on the purchasing team and giving feedback about what they needed in order to do an effective job on the street. So we were able to move that. It's always, you open yourself up for criticism in the public sector when you buy something that is not the lowest cost. So what you have to really do is quantify what the reasons are while you're buying a product that is not the lowest.
And I think this is Tom, a byproduct of that whole process, which is relatively revolutionary, was the fact that relationships got built between the finance department and frontline entities that usually were at arm's length. They started working together in order to improve the way in which we did the buying processes for parts and equipment.
I think one of the things that's weaved into this story is it's kind of, there's this focus on the project, but this was a time, this project kind of led to a large scale change in management practices, didn't it, Mike?
It did. It did. We actually adopted this approach to tackling problems. And relative to an earlier question, what happens when people don't support it? There were people who didn't. And in my advice and my experience tells me that what you do is you seek out the champions, the people who want to embrace change, who see that there's a better way to do things. You work with them, then you demonstrate success, you get some early wins, and that builds momentum. But there's always going to be the Missourians, the ones who say, show me, who don't want to actually get on board. And you kind of deal with those one retirement at a time.
Yeah, there's a question out here, Michael, about the 85-15 rule. I think the question kind of says that how universal is that known that it's 85-15? Because people are familiar with the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle, but I'm not sure people are as familiar with what Deming called his 85-15 rule.
Yeah, and I've heard before Deming died, I think he went to actually 94-6.
Yeah.
He just kept believing more and more stuff was the responsibility of the system, and who has control over the system? That's management. And so, is it commonly understood? No. Most of what happens is something goes wrong, doesn't perform as expected, and people begin to look for somebody to blame. And that, as we all know, those of us who work in process understand that that's not the right approach. It's not what usually happens. Sometimes, yes, it might be an individual who fell, but Deming would go back and say, training. You need to do training. You need to be invest in these people. They need to understand how to do their job, and then you can have a better chance. But the first thing you have to do is look at the process, look at the system, and make sure it's working effectively.
I think that's idea of looking at the system. People forget that people are part of the system, and that's it. So your story really gets that across. Where once you started bringing the people from the system into talking about it, you guys were able to move some stuff forward.
Did you look at metrics at all? Like, let's say purchasing might have been rewarded or judged against how much they spent or how much they saved, and that might be fight against you this effort to buy a better product that has, longer time between breakdowns. I don't know if you have to change any metrics in the whole process of implementing your solution.
That's a great question. There was continual work on the metrics and improving the metrics, but given that this was our first process that we were working on, we dealt with the simple metrics that's there. How long is it taking? How many steps are there? Ultimately, we got better at measuring and we're able to justify spending more money for products, getting down to simple, Deming used to say you should have one supplier, and that supplier you should develop a partnership with, and you should not change, and that helps build relationships going forward. So, but we didn't have very sophisticated metrics, but they were sophisticated enough to convince people that change was needed.
I think an interesting fact here, Bob, is that this project occurred when, Michael? What year? About
1983.
Like 1983. In 1983, most people didn't have a computer sitting at their desk. So they weren't using Excel. I think it wasn't even called Excel. It was called Lotus 123 or something. So I mean, we didn't really have very sophisticated techniques, but it was your statistician who came in and really helped the organization better understand how to measure it all, right, Michael?
Yeah, we were using check sheets, pencil and sheets of paper, and we're just checking off pieces. So
Yeah.
You're right, Tim, but the technology was not very advanced then.
Yeah. So, but it's a great story. I mean, I just love reading the story in the book, and it's just a great example of how you were engaging people. And I think that's coming around. I mean, like I say, it sounds like it's dated, but a lot of things I've seen kind of making a full circle here in terms of how we're engaging people and bringing them into the process. And it's not just projects. So,
Tim, can I add one other thing before we move on? The motor equipment facility currently in Madison, we have a brand new state-of-the-art motor equipment facility. And it's nationally ranked as one of the top 5 motor equipment facilities in the country. All energy, environmentally sound. People are looking at it. We're testing out the first electric fire truck out of Pierce, and an array of other things related to try and upgrade It is pretty amazing to see this story that Michael is sharing evolve over time, where continuous improvement over time was applied as a way of bending granite in a particular culture that today puts motor equipment. And any of you want to go to the website and see this place, it's pretty spectacular right now, how technology and environmental integrity has been applied to the motor equipment work here in Madison.
All right, I'm going to move us on to our third story. And the third story is from our book, and it's by somebody who served, Luis Udice, who served in the Madison Police Department. He's a retired chief of operations, started in 1974 and served in the police department for 31 years. This is a great story. It's about the same time Michael's, maybe a little bit later, maybe around 85. And he's telling the story about, he's going to tell the story about how they were changing their management practices to apply quality and quality principles. Just to give you an idea about Luis, he's been assigned to mental health services, hostage negotiations, SWAT commander, captain of detectives, and more. He's really got some street cred in talking about this particular subject. He's also a native of Guatemala, and he served in the Marine Corps. The title of his story is The Sergeant's Role in Leading Change. So I'll leave it there, and I'll play the story and get your thoughts.
I was a sergeant when total quality management was introduced to the police department in Madison, Wisconsin in the late 1970s. I was appropriately cautious. Given the nature of policing, the concept of loosening the reins of an organization and giving greater voice to the employees seemed just too good to be true. What was the catch? Having previously served in the Marine Corps, the traditional paramilitary style of management suited me just fine. Orders came from above, each rank passed them on to the next, and ultimately, we sergeants were responsible for ensuring they were carried out by the troops. The thought that ideas and plans for serving our city could be germinated from the bottom level of the organization was not in our consciousness. The story of how continuous improvement in policing unfolded in Madison in the 1980s and 90s is a tale of an adventurous undertaking that led to transformative change. It also created turmoil. These changes included a total restructuring of the organization, as well as a reassessment of how we managed, supervised, and controlled personnel and the flow of ideas. The development of new tools and strategies unleashed the human potential for our talented commissioned and civil personnel. But all this required a flattening of the chain of command, investment in training for every member of the department, and buy-in from the command staff, as well as a long-term commitment on everyone's part to the new management model. When Mayor Joe Sensenbrenner introduced quality improvement concepts to city government, Madison was a city in transition, already marked by great urbanization with a hint of potential big city problems. Violent crime was on the increase. School safety concerns led to early experimentations with the placement of officers in school, and the arrival of crack, cocaine, gangs, and violence soon wreaked havoc in many of our neighborhoods. Madison was caught off guard and unprepared, and so were us in law enforcement. Addressing these complex and violent situations demanded a creative mind, flexible thinking, and a data-driven process capable of identifying root causes to help focus the department's already stretched resources to where they were most needed. Madison at the time badly needed a different approach. It required police officers to become problem solvers, out-of-the-box thinkers, and employees empowered to initiate solutions. Above all, it required a new organizational model that allowed for the free flow of ideas unencumbered by the bureaucratic levels of control. For most officers, the search for quality policing brought welcome change. It offered police officers an opportunity to have their voice heard and to redefine themselves as individuals who could contribute to the positive change in an environment that rewarded initiative and creativity. For others, however, the change was more difficult. Learning to let go and trust that the majority of employees would do their job well did not come easy. One of Edward Deming's principles of quality improvement is that as much as 94% of variation in performance is caused by the system, with as little as 6% caused by people. This is difficult for managers and supervisors who believe that a well-run department needed lots of rules, regulations, and policies to maintain order and discipline. Change was tough on some of the on-ground officers as well, particularly for those who preferred the old ways. They showed up for work, did what was expected, and that was the end of it. But these changes were perhaps most difficult on our first-line supervisors. That is, we sergeants, who had the most direct contact with patrol officers, who made up the bulk of the department. Under the traditional model, sergeants were the first line in the chain of command. We supervised, directed, and reviewed our officers' work product, investigated misconduct, and responded to citizens' complaints. Sergeants were responsible for conducting the department's annual performance evaluation. In my opinion, sergeants form the backbone of the police department. The systematic improvement efforts of the Madison Police Department sometimes upended the sergeant's authority. Officers no longer needed to check with us before going into the captain's office to discuss an idea or to complain about workplace rules. If given approval, they could implement new strategies, enlist the assistance of other city departments, or create teams with fellow officers to address the problems in their beat. To a certain extent, sergeants ceased to exist. We were no longer essential. The flattening of the organization ensured we were no more than placeholders in the staffing chart. The sergeant's role was sometimes reduced to that of a spectator. We were expected to coach our officers, provide them support, and give them feedback. But in general, we were asked to get out of the way of the bright and motivated officers who were leading the changes in policing that we knew were desperately needed. Most of us relished our new role and did it well, but others were bewildered and confused. Critical responsibilities, such as the investigation of complaints against police officers, were removed from us and given to internal affairs. Performance evaluations were discontinued altogether. These changes tended to undermine the role and authority of the sergeant, who had the most intimate knowledge of our officers' strengths and weakness, and most importantly, of how they interacted with the community. Few in our organizations work as closely with the people on the ground as we did. No one else was as capable of understanding how stress and frustration with the judicial system could potentially lead to policy violations and abuse of authority. The sergeant's role has always been a difficult one. As neither line officer or manager, we are expected to supervise and reinforce strict adherence to the law, department policies, and critical concepts regarding constitutional rights. Our jobs are even more difficult by the fact that we work alongside our officers and face the same difficult work conditions that are far removed from the department's mission statement and the rarefied levels of management teams. The systematic improvement movement in the Madison Police Department was successful in innumerable ways, and it led to the recruitment of many bright and committed young men and women who wanted to join our agency. It's not by accident that the Madison Police Department has been nationally recognized as a leader in policing and innovation. But perhaps we missed an opportunity to fully examine the benefits and potential negative impact of these foundational changes created for our frontline supervisors. Improvement has to be continuous, and we must adhere to the principles and accept that reassessing where we've been is part of the change process. The principles of the quality management movement provided the tools in the past we needed to reimagine the sergeant's role. They can do so again. Those same principles can help meet the needs and challenges of tomorrow's policing organizations.
Well, there's a lot to unpack in that story. And what I'm really interested in your thoughts is, as they made changes in their management structures, what do you run into? What sort of things do you see? What has to be, what story was uncovered here for them? Any thoughts? Go ahead and text if you're, I see Will, if your mic isn't working, you don't have a mic, if you want to text something. Anybody else that does have a mic or can unmute themselves or can text? Yeah, there, Will, I see you're on. Oh, here we go. You know, he says, I'm not understanding how the sergeant's roles were redesigned, what tools were actually used. I may be jumping the gun here. The truth is, sometimes I think when you start to make a new management paradigm or change in how you manage, and this is a pretty significant change, as you can see, they're going from a paramilitary organization to one where they're completely flattening this organization, giving people the ability to bring up change ideas without going through the channels, the usual channels that all of these people over these years have gone through, have experienced before and have been used to. And now expecting that mid-level manager to be able to manage in that environment, it's possible, Will, that they didn't make a change in how they were going to start using that group of employees, the mid-level managers. It probably uncovered itself. It's like today's solution or today's idea creates tomorrow's problems. And I think Luis in his story really tried to point out some of the issues that were brought forth. Any in particular, Tom or Michael, that you noticed that came forth, the issues that came forth that might have been huge issues for them?
Yeah, let me share perspective on this. I think the biggest transformation in the police department was when the police chief, David Cooper, led an effort to transform our police department from being traditional law enforcers as an emphasis to being peacekeepers, which is just a radical shift in the way you think about policing, the way in which you recruit talent, the way in which you train talent and deploy talent. And one of our principles was educate first, regulate only if you must. Now, that really transformed the way in which we operated. And it reflected in the supervisory role, particularly because we really emphasized every sergeant for when they were going to move up to be considered for sergeant role from being on the line, they would have to do an improvement project. So it was building in a culture, transforming a culture. And we could have done so much more at that sergeant role, but there was about 3-4 things we did at the sergeant role as kind of the linchpins in that culture that really transformed how we operated from a traditional law enforcement organization to a much more peacekeeping emphasis that resulted in almost 40% of our officers being women, because we learned that you didn't have to have big burly guys to communicate and effectively do peace work.
So Tim, I think there's another parallel here too that most people could relate to. The most resistance to this type of change of involving the frontline employee typically comes from middle managers, whether they be sergeants or someone else. They've had a defined role. It's been of a kind of a control role. And then that changes and you start asking the employees, the people that I found that were most disenchanted were the middle managers. And it really requires paying attention to them, finding out what their new role is, how that can be, and trying to listen for where they're coming from. Because the front employees are delighted that you're talking to them. Management's happy because you're getting better results, but you oftentimes get resistance from middle managers.
Anybody out there want to respond? Can you respond?
This is Shruti. Thank you for that wonderful stories. I do have a question not related directly to the story, but in general, that whenever you're taking these process improvement initiatives, even if you start with high enthusiasm and high energy, it doesn't always sustain. And some of the process improvement initiatives just get blocked or they go nowhere, and it could be depending on various reasons. It could be change in the management or any other reasons for that. But how, like, what would your suggestion be to restart some of those kind of processes, and how to pick up from where it was left? And sometimes these processes, when they end like that, out of nowhere, they usually have like a negative um, memory associated with it. So how do you wipe off that negative memory and restart and have it become successful?
Well, I'm not completely sure how you wipe out the memory. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you do some damage, by not, it's an example of not anticipating all the potential ways that your changes are going to affect, be positive or negative. And that's a difficult thing to do, especially when you change a management paradigm. But I think one of the things that I got out of Louise's story is that he was positive, even though he recognized some of the difficulties. And in his story in the book, he goes on to talk about potential solutions, not for the past either, but for the present, in an organization that I don't think is probably as quality oriented as it was during the late 80s and 90s in Madison. One of the other questions I got asked in the online was, and I'll just touch on it briefly. We only have a couple of minutes, and that is about the training. And I do know that the city did extensive training with their department in QI and so on and so forth. But they still, even with the training, came upon some issues with the various structures in their organization as to bringing them along. All right. I wish we could talk forever, but it doesn't look like we're going to be able to. We got a couple of minutes, and I just want to get our panelists to just touch on their final thoughts about our book and the work that we did in bringing these stories forward. Can I start with you, Michael?
Sure. First of all, I just want to thank everybody for joining us, and just for you to know that we really support the work that you're doing out there in your organizations. We understand how hard it is, but also we've seen the benefits of that. And that's one of the things that this book captures is our experiences, the lessons learned, but also the success stories about how if you persevere and continue to use the practices, that good management practices that we know are out there, but are oftentimes too hard to find in our organizations, that we can generate good results. So we support your work. We encourage you to take a look at the book and other stories to see what's in there. And hopefully there are some lessons that you can use in your efforts.
Thanks, Michael. Tom?
I would just add the fact that we wrote this book as a collection of stories because we wanted it to amplify the importance and the power of stories. And all too much of our work, we're moving so fast or caught up in our daily work in our places that we forget to capture the stories. And we're basically working off the hunch that if people hear these stories, use them as case studies, they can help them increase the odds, no matter what time in history it is, that improvement is always in vogue.
I'll just end with this slide points out that we still have a website about our book, but more so we're moving on with stories on our podcast, Bending Granite. So if you get a chance, join in and listen to us there. And if you have a story you want to do a podcast, let me know.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, all three of you. Thank you for the great stories you shared with us and for answering all these questions. On the screen, you can find the information of Tim and Tom. You can contact them. Feel free to contact Tim if you would like to get in touch with Michael. And you have Larry Edwards' information. He's our division's chair. If nobody has any question, thank you all for joining, and we will see you at our next event.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.